momento, por favor.
Ok.
Muy bien, gracias a todos por estar conectados, a nuestros estudiantes, docentes y público en general. El panel que vamos a tener el día de hoy se va a llevar a cabo en inglés, en el idioma inglés. Entonces, a nuestros asistentes que son hispanoparlantes y que desean ver como tal lo que están exponiendo los participantes, ustedes pueden activar la transcripción simultánea. ¿Sí? Hay un botón en el Zoom que está en la parte de abajo, ¿sí?, de la pantalla donde dice transcripción, activar la transcripción simultánea. Entonces ustedes le pueden dar clic y allí pueden ver en tiempo real, en el idioma inglés, lo que están exponiendo los panelistas. Asimismo, tenemos la opción de que puedan ustedes ver la traducción simultánea en español dando clic en el perfil de la Universidad de Ecotec, ¿sí? Si ustedes anclan el perfil, la foto de la Universidad de Ecotec, pueden ver de un lado a los panelistas que están exponiendo y del otro lado la transcripción en español, ¿sí? Podemos tener esas dos opciones. Muy bien. Bueno, entonces, dicho esto, vamos a iniciar. Gracias a todos por conectarse. Adelante, Lisette.
Okay. Thanks, Solange. Then when I want to thank everyone to join us today, my name is Lisette Mendez, and I'm a professor in economics at Ecotec University, located in San Borondón, Ecuador. I'd like to welcome all of you to the event Reimagining the Economy, Business and Social Sciences, organized by the Faculty of Economics, Sciences and Business, the Accreditation Council for Business Schools and Programs, the Ecuadorian Academic Network of Economics, and the Latin American Council of Management Schools. Okay, the goal of this event is to discuss the new global challenges, analyze them, and imagine new ideas to improve economics, business, and other social sciences. In panel 8, we will talk about reconciling social sciences, the individual, the economy, and the state. Well, I want to give a brief introduction. The global economy is changing every day due to different endogenous and exogenous factors that have a positive or a negative impact on individual enterprises and governments across the world. The repeated financial crisis, the rise of economic and social inequalities, the emerging risks to human health as coronavirus or the global climate change have shown the necessity of a new political economic order where information and communication technologies are the key element of the solution. What is the future of this new political economic order? Is a global or a local order? Who should lead this global change? Are we really prepared for a new economic order? Well, these are some big questions that I wish you have in mind during the presentations of our wonderful speakers, because I'm sure they have excellent ideas on this topic. It is a pleasure for me to introduce the next wonderful speakers. Our first guest is Pierre-André Hudon. He is a PhD in public administration by the University of Ottawa in Canada and professor at Laval University. He was president of HAC Consulting, director of strategic studies in finance, Montreal. He was a postdoctoral research at ENAP in Montreal and associate research at Canada Research Chair in Governance and Public Management. Our second speaker is Robert Flecker. He holds a PhD in economics by Stanford University. He is a professor of economics and affiliate faculty of the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at American University in Washington, D.C., USA. He is also a fellow of the Forum for Macroeconomics and Macroeconomic Policy. His most recent book is Heterodox Macroeconomics, Models of Demand, Distribution, and Growth, co-author with Mark Setterfield. He has published widely in leading economics journals, including the Cambridge Journal of Economics and Economica. His research includes work on neo-Kalekian macro theory, post-Keynesian models of open economies, and international trade theory and policy. We also are glad to receive Louis-Philippe Russon. He is a full professor of economics at Laurentian University in Canada, where he has been teaching since 2004. Before that, he taught at Kalamazoo College in Michigan. He obtained his doctorate from the New School for Social Research in 1998, earning him the Frida Gordelik Award for Outstanding Dissertation. He is editor-in-chief of the Review of Political Economy since 2021. Before that, he created the Review of Keynesian Economics and was its editor from 2012 to 2019. He has been guest editor of many journals, and he has published on monetary theory and policy, post-Keynesian economics, and fiscal policy. He is also on the editorial board of different journals like Ola Financiera and International Journal of Political Economy. Last but not least, we welcome Stephen Angina. He holds a PhD by the University of Oregon. He is a professor of banking at the University of Zurich in Switzerland, a senior chair at the Swiss Finance Institute, a research professor at KU Leuven, and a research fellow in financial economics of Center for Economic and Policy Research. He is also a research professor at Deutsche Bundesbank. He has published almost 100 papers in refereed journals, including in the American Economic Review, Econometrica, and the Journal of Finance. In 2017, he received a European Research Council Advanced Grant, and in 2012, an NYU Fordham RPI Rising Star in Finance Award. So I want to remind you, everyone, the dynamic of this forum. Each expert will have 12 minutes to present their lectures, and at the end of every dissertation, I will ask them a question. Then all experts have finished, when all experts have finished, they will be giving 1.5 minutes to sum up their participation. And also, I'm going to tell you when you have 3 minutes left, okay? Now, please, Professor André Hudon, could you start or share your file?
Certainly. I do not have slides, actually. I will,
don't worry.
You'll have to look at me instead.
Thank you.
Well, gracias por invitarme. Es un placer estar aquí. I was hoping to practice my Spanish, but I will practice my English instead. I was a little puzzled, to be honest, by the title of the panel. When I read the individual economy and the state, I thought this is pretty much everything, right? And I decided, and I am very much not an economist, contrary to my colleagues on the panel, but I've spent all my career, my academic career, looking at the interactions between the state and the private sector. I was a postdoc in public admin. I was a PG in political science, and I've always been very interested in the interface between the respective sectors. Being a prof of public admin, I was never one to need convincing of the importance of the state as a vector for the common good, but for many of my colleagues in business schools, state action has always been, well, at best, something that needs to be fine-tuned, and at worst, something that needs to be tamed. I've always had a more optimistic view of public administrations, and that's what I'm trying to get at in this lecture today, is that as much as we hear criticism about the big state, about the heavy state, about the slow state, about the even corrupt state sometimes, we are regularly reminded, and the COVID pandemic is probably the biggest reminder of all, that for all its shortcoming, the only actor that can act effectively in a time of crisis is the state. And this is what I want to be talking about today. The COVID pandemic has highlighted the utmost importance of public administration, not only in coordinating efforts, but also in being a very active player in terms of responding to the crisis. We've heard a lot about different topics that are the very visible parts of the government action, which is not what I want to talk about, but we've seen what governments can do when they put their mind to it. They can order lockdown, they can make masks mandatory, they can order border crossings, they can organize vaccination campaigns. They're actually quite effective at doing this in a time of crisis. They're also very good, well, depending on the government, obviously, but they've been pretty good at passing stimulus plans. Just before the panel, our colleagues here were discussing the stimulus panel in the US, and there's even a lot of people that are saying that Keynesian economics is back, and it's probably one of the main, the biggest legacies of this. But I have another perspective. What I'd like to talk about is something less evident, but that shows a much more intricate side of government action, which is public procurement. The efforts that the governments have deployed in ensuring the proper supply of personal protection equipment, of medication, of medical equipment, and of course of vaccines are nothing short of spectacular. I would almost say revolutionary in these instances. And this is ongoing research that I'm talking about, but I can give you some preliminary results, is that our hypothesis, which is being tested and being slowly confirmed, is that in a time of crisis, governments play a much more active than usual role in awarding public contracts. Government tends to move away from the standardized frameworks of public procurement and instead take a much more active, operational, we could even say entrepreneurial, innovative, and even strategic role in making the public procurement, the acquisition functions. We hypothesize, and I was saying this is ongoing work, but it's starting to look pretty convincing, judging by the results we have right now, that there's 4 types of strategies that are used by governments. I'll rank them from the most short term to the longer term ones. The first strategy is the exception to the standard public procurement procedures aimed at speeding up purchases. This was the very first responses we've seen somewhere in the spring of 2020 when the pandemic started to be very, very evident. I'll give you examples from our Canadian province of Quebec here, because that's the one I know best, but I know this is something that has been happening everywhere in the world, especially in Western countries. For example, here in the Canadian province of Quebec, the sanitary emergency decree has enabled governments to circumvent public call to tender procedures, for example, the need to receive bids, or the maximum amounts of direct procurement, the maximum amounts for direct procurement contracts. So basically what we've seen is in the very short term, the first response was to actually be able to, get the contracts going very, very fast. This is obviously a risky strategy because, for example, fraud can very easily seep into these contracts. We know that some money was almost lost to fraudster because of a big scandal that luckily was nipped in the bud fairly quickly. But I'm sure more stories will be coming out. So that's probably the first strategy. The second strategy is that we've also seen governments play the role of, I'll say, brokers or actually logistical facilitators. For example, and this has been accompanied by organizational changes. For example, what we've noticed here in Quebec, and I know it's been the case in other Canadian provinces as well, is that there's been a tendency for centralizing on the spur of the moment the procurement functions by the state. Normally, especially for for personal protective equipment, for medical material, in our system, the hospitals had a lot of leeway in terms, or the various hospital groups had a lot of leeway in terms of buying their own medical equipment. The crisis has made so that there was a centralization that happened on the spot, and that actually, from the echoes I'm getting from the government, might actually remain this way for the future. So we've seen this crisis turn into an organizational change before our very eyes. We've also seen the government play the active role of logistical facilitators, something that new roles that were never even envisioned, in the past. For example, we've seen the government's commissioning planes, going to pick up materials abroad. We've seen the government exchanging suitcases full of cash and tarmacs in airports. This has been widely reported. This is obviously not the kind of action you see in a standard procurement department, but the crisis has enabled this to happen. In a more strategic, this might be a bit anecdotal, but in a more strategic view, what we've seen also is this has created extreme competition between countries, between big and small countries. Canada is certainly a wealthy country, but it is by no means a big country on the world stage. It's been exacerbated, or this phenomenon is even more visible when we look at the difference of wealth between countries, the rich and the poor countries. The access to personal protective equipment and, of course, to vaccines has been highlighted. The differences have been highlighted, which is very worrisome in the medium term. But I feel like this period, these strategies might already be over, as the sense of urgency, at least in our part of the world, has decreased. What we are looking at right now in the medium term is longer term organization or longer term industrial changes. For example, in the very first moments of the crisis, we've seen some anecdotal or even gimmicky instances of rapid industrial conversions. For example, gin distilleries that started manufacturing hand sanitizer, or flight simulator companies reorganizing their factories to build respirators. This is anecdotal, but what we've seen in terms of what we're seeing now in terms of actual lasting changes is how weak our logistical supply chains were, and that this is a lasting problem, and a problem that's been happening for a while, especially in the supply of vaccines. As I was saying, Canada is a wealthy country, but we realized a bit too late that we did not have the ability to produce vaccines. We kind of do now, but it's 2 years into the crisis. So this has been something that will have had a long-lasting impact in terms of governmental action. And finally, and this is where we are right now, this is a reflection we're having right now in terms of, reinventing the state post-crisis with regards to procurement at the very least, is what will be the lasting impacts? A greater centralization, maybe better legislative safeguards for emergency procedures to prevent abuse, because when you circumvent the traditional procurement mechanisms, well, you open up the room for abuse. So maybe one of what I'm hoping will come out of this is actually a safeguard platform for making sure that even in a time of crisis, the procurement function remains well regulated. And I'm seeing I have 1 minute left. I guess this is a call for the need for strengthening the procurement function of governments, not only in times of crisis, of course, in times of crisis, but overall, I think that the transition we're seeing is that procurement will become a bigger and bigger part of government action. That we need competent people, we need to define the competencies, and that we need the sheer workforce and maturity of the procurement function. And I'll leave you with a final thought, which might open up the discussion somehow, is that we've seen governments that can act very swiftly and effectively in the face of crisis, but there is another impeding crisis, which is certainly more deadly than COVID, and it's the climate change crisis. And we're wondering, why are we so good at mobilizing ourselves for COVID, but so bad at mobilizing ourselves for climate change? And I have no answer to provide you, just a question mark. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hudon. Well, my question is about the governments in Latin America. No, what do you recommend in specific for the Latin American region? No, we have very different types of governments. For example, in Mexico, that is not much environmental government, right? But maybe there are some or a lot of countries that are doing an effort in climate change. Not much, but some of them. But what can they do in a specific?
Well, it's an extremely wide question. I guess the avenue I would suggest for improving governance is, first of all, to leave the politics out of it, in the sense that a lot of these issues are very technical, and that a lot can be done without involving politics. And we could have a whole other debate about, representativity and democracy and democratic governance. But for a lot of technical issues, this is true for procurement during the COVID crisis, but this is also true for very technical sides of, scientific sides of climate change action. A lot of it can be done at the civil service level. So I guess my concern, if I had to, and I might be biased because I'm a process public admin, but I think we need to strengthen our civil services. We need to make sure that they remain competent, that they remain relevant, and that they're properly funded. And this usually goes against the idea of lower taxes and lower state revenues. So we need to make sure that the machine keeps going. And if I may, because I heard my colleague Robert Bleeker talk about Trump earlier. What I found fascinating was that even during the Trump debacle, or whatever you want to call it, the U.S. kept functioning, because the U.S. is a big country with a good, civil service, and despite profound incompetence at the top, the government kept working. So I mean, this goes to show how important the civil service is. And I would go that way for Latin America. And I'm fully aware that Latin America is not one country. It's many different countries with many different realities as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Well, now I want to introduce again Professor Robert Flecker. Please, could you start?
Yes, hello, buenos dias, bonjour, and if anyone from Brazil is here, bom dia. So it's a great pleasure to be part of this conference, and I really want to thank Lisette Mendes for organizing this and inviting me and these other distinguished panelists. I too would like to practice my Spanish, but instead I will try to speak in English that is understandable. And my talk is going to be very different. It's much more theoretical. I suspect it will complement well what Professor Russon will discuss. But I think it does have a link to the current issues, even though I will be talking about theoretical perspectives. But when governments go to make policies, the way they think about doing that is often circumscribed by theoretical paradigms that may limit their thinking. And so understanding that there are different and alternative perspectives available can be very helpful for enabling public policy to respond, whether it's in a short-term crisis or a more long-term situation. So with that, I do have a presentation. I am now going to attempt to share my screen. Let's do this in Adobe. Is everybody seeing that? And now we want the full screen. Good. I am a little out of practice because we have been teaching in person at my university this year. So this is my first Zoom presentation in several months. Anyway, my talk will be about alternative perspectives on macroeconomics, focusing on heterodox approaches to economic growth and business cycles. So painting with a very broad brush and very wide terms, there are two broad approaches to macroeconomics. What we might call mainstream or orthodox macro includes everything from the Keynesian cross model and ISLM in your undergraduate textbook to monetarism, the solo growth model, real business cycles, new Keynesian models, and all sorts of things in the advanced literature. Clearly, that is a very diverse group, and it contains many contending perspectives. But there's another, excuse me, there's another tradition, which I call heterodox, evidently not orthodox, macroeconomics. And that's a tradition with deep roots in the classical economists, dating back to Ricardo and Marx and others, and especially the work of John Maynard Keynes. And by the way, it was Keynes who said, I think Louis Philippe can help with getting the quote right, that economic policy makers are usually listening to some academic scribbler of the past. And so that was a reference to how important it is to get our theoretical ideas right so that we can understand what policies are possible and necessary. And I would also emphasize for this audience that the heterodox approach from the Anglo-American world, Britain and the US, it turns out to have a great deal of affinity for Latin American structuralism. And many ideas kind of evolved separately in these two different traditions. And then later it was recognized that they actually overlap and are essentially saying similar things. So this is, again, a very broad group, very diverse, and it contains many contending perspectives. Professor Mendes, Dr. Mendes kindly mentioned my book, but I would actually recommend 4 major textbooks on the subjects I will discuss today. So my book with Mark Setterfield is first only because of alphabetical order. Also the book by Duncan Foley, Tom Michael, and Daniele Tavani, Growth and Distribution, from also 2 years ago. and the books by Eckhard Hein and Marc Lavoie from Canada. And actually, a lot of what I say today, for what I discussed today, the best source is Lavoie's book. And he is working on a new edition, so there will be a revised Lavoie out soon. So I can only be very brief. I think I have more slides than I can cover, but I'll do a few broad points. So one thing that describes heterodox macro is that it's based on inductive rather than deductive reasoning. We start with empirical generalizations or stylized facts rather than postulates about rational behavior and perfect markets. Heterodox macro also is based on a structuralist or organicist approach. That is, it looks at whole systems and tries to understand how they function instead of using methodological individualism, which is characteristic of the neoclassical models. And then this is exactly where heterodox macro overlaps with structuralism, because it recognizes that different kinds of models are needed for different kinds of countries and historical conditions. Another feature of most heterodox macro is that it views the long run as a succession of short and medium run periods. That is, I think, how Keynes and another contemporary of his, Michał Kalecki of Poland, viewed it. But there are some heterodox economists who focus more on long period equilibria and believe that those are strong attractors. Heterodox economists, and I include myself in this, would like to build evolutionary models with cumulative causation and path dependency, and we would like to integrate the analysis of trends and cycles, tendencias y ciclos. But I have to admit that for many of us, it is mathematically quite challenging to do that. And so for analytical convenience, we often use equilibrium techniques and equilibrium models to represent our core ideas, even when our ultimate objective is to build a more dynamic analysis. There are several key behavioral assumptions in heterodox macro models. One is that rationality is bounded or procedural rather than complete. So we are not the super optimizing agents of the micro textbook, fundamentally because we could not possibly have the information needed to do that. Secondly, there is what we call Keynesian fundamental uncertainty. We do not even know the probability distributions for future events. And we believe that expectations are likely to be subjective or myopic instead of rational. And most economic agents are financially or liquidity constrained. That includes many firms as well as households. And that means you have to look at income flows and income distribution to understand macro performance. Most heterodox macroeconomists believe that output is limited by effective demand rather than supply side constraints, even in the long run. Now that's under normal conditions. It's not true in, say, wartime. And I would also make an exception for developing countries. So in the Andean region, for example, supply side constraints and institutional barriers are very important. But I would also say that in developing countries, demand side constraints also play a role, and that ignoring those can lead to serious errors in policy and countries not achieving their growth potential. And one example of that is the importance of the balance of payments in constraining what countries are able to do unless they promote their exports adequately. I'm going to skip some of this for reasons of time, and I think some of this maybe Professor Russon will cover, but very importantly, we have different kinds of agents in heterodox models: workers, firms, rentiers who receive interest and dividends. We could distinguish workers by different features or even gender, for example. Traditionally, we have focused on business firms in the financial sector, and that's still very important. But I think the events of the last 2 decades have led to more attention on household behavior, household debt, and other dimensions of inequality, like in the personal distribution and inequality across race and gender lines. And so something that I think is very core in most heterodox macro modeling is that income distribution plays a key role. It's not something we just discovered. It is something that has been core to our approach for, more than a half century. And that income distribution, of course, is not exogenous, but also is endogenously determined in the growth process. How much time do I have left?
Okay. You have, if you want, 5 minutes left, because Professor Steven Angina apologized. He had technological issues, so he won't be with us. So he just sent me an email because he had some troubles, internet problems. So if you want, you can have 5 minutes or 7 minutes left.
Okay.
Robert,
Well,
you just scared the guy away. Congratulations.
Now, Louis Philippe, I thought you were just going to correct my quote from Keynes.
Oh.
All right, I will try to be brief so that we can leave some time for discussion. So let me just cover 2 more slides where I try to categorize the different kinds of macro models. This slide compares heterodox macro across the rows versus orthodox mainstream models in the second row, and the columns show whether the theories emphasize supply side determinants of growth or demand side determinants of growth. So among the heterodox theories, there are some that view the economy as largely supply side driven, at least in the long run. Those would be the classical and Marxian models. And even in something called Goodwin cycles, which are a way of representing Marx's theory of income distribution and business cycles, these are essentially supply driven in the short run. On the other hand, the post-Keynesian models model growth as demand driven in both the long run and the short run. There are many variations of the post-Keynesian models. I will cover them in more detail on the next slide. And they certainly vary among themselves. In the orthodox tradition or mainstream tradition, the standard distinction is that the supply side dominates exclusively in the long run. So that's true in all of the old and new growth models, whether it's Solow or Romer or anyone else. The long run is always completely determined by the supply side. However, some mainstream models, the old-fashioned Keynesian ISLM and the so-called new Keynesian, allow for demand-side factors to operate in the short run. Again, there are exceptions. At the extreme, what we used to call the new classical macroeconomists of the 1970s and 80s, who morphed into the real business cycle approach later, model the economy as supply-driven in the short run. Like business cycles are caused by something called technology shocks. It's hard to find a technology shock in 2008 or in 2020, but they would claim there was one. And on the other side, I think especially in light of the profound effects of the last 2 crises, the great financial crisis of 2008 and the current COVID crisis, more and more mainstream economists are starting to recognize that demand also matters in the long run because it affects the creation of productive capacity or potential output. And these are people I would call here, I follow Marc Lavoie, for whom I have great admiration. I call them mainstream dissenters, and there's getting to be more and more of them. Now, I will leave you with this, I admit, rather overwhelming slide. it sort of grew out of an effort by Mark Setterfield, the other Mark, and myself to think about the outline of our book, where I categorize different growth theories into the neoclassical or mainstream ones on the left, and then the heterodox in the middle and the right. The heterodox, in turn, are divided into classical Marxian and post-Keynesian, and then I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different kinds of post-Keynesian models. And this, by the way, is only for long-run growth because, or business cycles. There are other approaches that don't fit in this categorization. And maybe for reasons of time, let me just focus on the post-Keynesian models. And I will humbly say that the book of Setterfield and myself is one of the best places to find this literature, but the books by Lavoie and Hein are also very, very good. So the roots really go back to the early neo-Keynesians of the late 1930s up to the 1960s and 70s. Roy Harrod, the early work of Nicholas Kaldor, Luigi Passanetti, Joan Robinson. And I put here Donald Harris, my own teacher, and the father of Vice President Kamala Harris was a major contributor to that tradition. The two key takeaways that you see down below here, the last row is key ideas. Two key takeaways were linking growth to income distribution, which had been a feature of the neo-Ricardian and Marxian models, but had been lost sight of in the neoclassical approach, and also a concern over the instability of the growth process, which goes back to Harrod. The neo-Kaleckian approach pioneered showing the possibility that growth could be wage-led instead of profit-led. There are many, many contributors here. I won't read all their names. Something that grew out of that, but it's a bit of a reaction to it, is the neo-Goodwin approach, which sort of combines post-Keynesian or Kaleckian and neo-Marxian principles and builds models of what I call distributive cycles led by a profit squeeze and profit-led demand. So they put the emphasis more on profits than on wages. The neo-Herodian models explore Harrod's idea of fundamental instability in capitalist markets and look at growth as inherently cyclical. And that's a very important literature, and our book is one of the few that covers that in depth. And then the last three approaches here are ones that have had a lot of influence in Latin America. These are where you have the most affinity for Latin American structuralism, the export-led growth models of Kaldor and others, the balance of payments constrained growth model of Thorwall and others, and something fairly recent, the super multiplier approach. You'll see a lot of Latin American names in here, going from right to left. Franklin Serrano and Fabio Freitas are Brazilian economists. In balance of payments constrained growth, we find Juan Carlos Moreno Briz, who was a mentor of Dr. Mendez, a good friend of mine from Mexico, Gilberto Lima and Ricardo Araújo from Brazil, Gabriel Porcile from Uruguay, and back in the old world, Alonso and Garcia Martin from Spain. So this has found a lot of support in the Latin American countries and is of high relevance to developing countries and smaller European countries. And the export-led growth, it may have less Latin American names here, but I think it also has a lot of interest in the continent. And there are efforts, by the way, to blend many of these different theories together. So you should not think of these as static boxes that never talk to each other. There's much overlap. In fact, I'll end with a story. A few years ago, I was giving a lecture at a summer school in Berlin, run by the FMM, and Mark Lavoie kindly put my name in one of those boxes as a Kaleckian. And then I got up and gave my lecture, and my lecture was Kaldorian and about balance of payments constrained growth. So it was in a different tradition. So those categories are only suggestive, and a lot of the exciting ideas, and especially when we get to applying these theories in the real world, come from efforts to bring the different insights together. And thank you for the extra time, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So you mentioned the importance of income distribution in all those models, heterodox models, no? And I wish you could say something that governments could do, or enterprises, or I don't know, who could do something to improve income distribution. What could be the recipe? Because it's a problem in the whole world, no?
Well, governments do have a lot of policy levers that affect income distribution. It's not direct. In the capitalist country, they can't just say, you know, these are the wages or these are the profits. But there are many things governments do that either directly or indirectly affect wages of workers and different groups in society. So I'll just think of some examples. So in terms of labor market policy, there's areas like minimum wage legislation, the rights of unions, whether those are recognized and protected, and if unions can operate freely or are constrained by violence or are run by companies, so they're like company unions. So the freedom to have, you know, labor organizing, upholding the labor rights as articulated by the International Labor Organization, Organización Mundial de Trabajo, creo. So there are many things that governments can do to enable workers to claim a higher share of national income, because in many, many countries, including in North America, at least the United States and Mexico, I'll let Philippe say if this is happening in Canada, the labor share has been falling for at least 2 decades, maybe more, depending on how you measure it. But there are some indirect links. So things governments do in terms of standard macro policies, fiscal and monetary policies, are extremely important for influencing income distribution. So take monetary policy. If you have an exclusive focus on inflation targeting and a very low inflation target, and you believe in these expectations models of inflation, then every time there's the slightest threat of future inflation, like it hasn't even happened yet, the central bank starts raising interest rates, and then this depresses employment, and workers can never get a pay increase. And it's notorious that in countries that have shifted to that kind of policy regime, we no longer see wages rising in the recovery and expansion phase the way they used to. In fact, I think Mark Setterfield published a paper in ROPE, Dr. Russon's journal, on exactly this subject. We have some more work we're doing on that. And then for fiscal policy, if fiscal policy is heavily constrained, then that keeps unemployment high and puts a downward pressure on wages. Mexico is a sad example, really, because they have these strong balanced budget requirements, and the AMLO government, in spite of being supposedly populist, has not changed that. They've had what they call austeridad republicana, Republican austerity, and it essentially means they have not done a big stimulus in an economy that desperately needs massive public investments. In the United States, I am hoping that this Biden plan for the Build Back Better agenda, the 3.5 trillion, I think that's actually, I can't remember what that is in Spanish. I think it's actually billones in Spanish.
Miles de millones.
No, it's millones de millones. Oh, millones de millones. Trillion. Well, we'll figure it out later. Mucho dinero. It's in danger in the Congress because of divisions. This goes back to the importance of politics. Government structures. A few Democrats in the Senate and House are currently blocking this. But this would be the most important both demand side stimulus and support to the supply side to enable women to go into the labor force, to make business more productive by improving infrastructure, and to create jobs and skills for the workforce. And it would do massive things to, I think, boost up the less affluent groups in society. And that's why we'll get 0 Republican votes from the Republican Party. And we're very worried about some conservative Democrats. But anyway, I mean, these are just a few examples. But again, both direct and indirect effects of government policy are very powerful in income distribution.
Thank you very much for this master class. Really is really enriching for us. Well, and now I'm going to, I wish to start with Professor Louis-Philippe Russon. If you want to share some file or not.
I've got nothing else to say now. Robert said it all. Now, my presentation is actually complements Robert's very well, because while his was very theoretical, I'm going to switch to more policy discussion. In a recent paper, Jamie Galbraith wrote that economics is a policy discipline, and we have to have something to say about policies. And I will. And I'm going to talk about fiscal policy and monetary policies, central banks. So I'm going to share my presentation with you guys.
Sorry. You have 15 between 15 to 20 minutes if you want. Sure.
Perfect. And is this, yeah, go. Okay. So first of all, for those who are, so I am an avid collector of French Canadian art. Chapeau to my colleague, Professor Houdon. And this is one of my, the statues that I own by Marie-Josée Roy. Those who are on Twitter, I encourage you to come and follow me on Twitter. Okay, so I'm going to start with just 2 quotes. Robert has his quotes, and so do I. So mainstream policies, to refer to Maynard Keynes, is akin to policies that cure the disease by killing the patient. And so I'm going to have something to say about that. And something else that's sort of really implicit or explicit in my presentation is the following quote by, I think, the #1 heterodox economist out there, John Robinson. The purpose of studying economics is not to acquire a set of, hold on, I've got to minimize, a set of ready-made answers to economic questions, but to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists. And I think that, again, this is a very important quote in this sort of COVID or post-COVID world in which we're heading. So let me begin by doing a full memento. For those who watched the movie Memento, it's a great movie. And the movie starts with the conclusion and goes backwards. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start with the conclusion of my paper. So what we have learned from COVID is there is no such things anymore as a government budget constraint. There are political constraints about whether we want to raise the debt ceiling or not, but these are political questions. These are not economic constraints. Mainstream models, I'm borrowing a page here from Roberts. Mainstream models are, and what we teach our students is that, we got to be careful. Governments can't spend like they want. They have to have their deficits financed. The central, what happens when governments finance their deficits? I'll have something to say about that. But these are questions that we literally, not me, but there are in the textbook still, right? But we saw that during COVID, governments did absolutely everything they wanted. To go back to what Professor Ridon said at the very beginning, was this a return of the master? To quote the book by Robert, help me, who wrote The Return of the Master, the bibliographer, the Keynes biographer. Anyways, I'm having a senior moment. And yeah, it was absolutely. And so anyways, what I take from this crisis was that governments were able to do whatever they wanted to. In Canada, we've literally nationalized the payroll, public and private sector payrolls. They were completely nationalized. And so that I want to say. And the second component is, again, central banks are waking up to new realities. And the financial crisis of 2007 or 2008, depending what you take as the start of the crisis, and COVID, central banks are waking up to new realities. They're performing very differently. They're doing things very differently. That goes against mainstream thinking. And so I just helped to create this new journal called Advances in Economics Education that will be published by Edward Elgar. And the first issue is on, what to teach students in the post-COVID world. And it's remarkable to me that if the crisis in 2007 was not, did not have that writing on the wall for mainstream economics, well, come on. COVID really was the death knell of mainstream. I don't know how we can go back in a post-COVID world to teach these ideas, these mainstream ideas that have been, in my mind, completely invalidated, theoretically, sure, but empirically. And I, just to say something on something that Robert said about mainstream versus heterodox models, I always sort of reduce these to the simple equation. For me, mainstream models are about stability and convergence, whereas heterodox models are about instability and fragility. And this sort of seeing these models in this way, I think goes a very long way, precisely in looking at policies. Now, I do realize that what I just said above may be very difficult to accept in developing countries, and especially in a country like Ecuador that is fully dollarized. Now, on that note, I am helping in the editing of a book with Andrés Arauz, who is the former presidential candidate in Ecuador. And we're doing a book on dollarization, and we're looking at some of these issues. That's going to be coming out in 2023. But yeah, so developing countries have who don't have their own sovereign currency. I don't want to go full MMT here, but it does pose problems, especially Ecuador, Argentina. There are some balance of constraints, balance of trade constraints, and they face harsher realities. Oh, I'm sorry, the class bias, gender bias. This was sort of the new realities that central banks are waking up to. I should have put that above. That, for me, I see central banks and monetary policy in terms of biases, class bias. How does interest rates affect income distribution? And how does it affect income distribution in terms of gender and in terms of racialized minorities? And how carbon biased are central banks today? And so you have central banks looking at all these issues, whereas, 10 years ago, or I should say 13 with the financial crisis, these were completely not on the research agenda of central banks. But if you Google central banks now, they do talk about income distribution and women. And of course, the green central banks, Mark Carney, for instance, and so many others. So these are new realities that are sort of reshaping the way we see central banks. And whether the mainstream is carrying that discussion far is an open question. I think that there's a real theoretical or ideological constraint there in seeing the neutrality of money in the long run. So there's, I've written there's a paper coming out on this where I bring out a bunch of quotes from central bankers who say things like, yes, it does have an impact on the women and it does have an impact on income distribution, but these are short-lived because in the end, money is neutral in the long run. So, but there's an awakening there that wasn't there 10 years ago. So yeah, COVID certainly has dealt a blow to the idea of budget constraints and certainly the idea of austerity. We mainstream still believe, and not as much during this crisis. I think they were afraid to say it out loud, but these deficits are said to be inflationary, that they lead to higher interest rates, which in turn leads to crowding out effects. And so we haven't really heard the Austerians all that loud, but they're starting now to come out as we're sort of hopefully leaving COVID behind. I think you're going to get that narrative a lot more now, and then return to austerity and all that. But let's look at what's happened. In Canada, the budget deficits of our governments has increased by 20 times. We had a deficit of 20 billion a year and a half ago, and now the deficit is 400 or close to $400 billion. I think it's 378, but perhaps my colleague has a more precise number than I do, but it's certainly close to 400. But it hasn't led to runaway inflation. Inflation is 4%. The target is 2%. And I should mention that a target of 2%, if you look back at the literature when they adopted inflation targeting in the early 1990s, there is zero empirical support for a 2% inflation target. And, so this 2% was really sort of an arbitrary number. It could have just been 4%. And if the target had been adopted at 4%, we wouldn't be talking about inflation today because it would have been on target. So, it's an artificial discussion that we're having on inflation. But certainly the issue of how deficits and debt raised interest rates, central banks are pushing interest rates right to the lower bound, and they're keeping them there with very minimal effort. And so this is directly something that post-Keynesians have been talking about for a very long time, going back to Joan Robinson, going back to Keynes, that, central bank, Keynes says in 1946, central banks can have any interest rate they want. And you can see that today. They can have any interest rates. And I have to say, even in developing countries, now, there might be implications and repercussions, but it doesn't mean that they can't have the interest rate that they want. So for me, there's monumental consequences for macroeconomic policy for having to abandon, to put aside the idea of a budget constraint and to argue in terms of political constraints, not economic constraints, because that changes the narrative completely. So the question to Robert before was, how do you deal with income distribution? You know, my answer to that is you just do it. You know, nothing stops governments from adopting higher capital gain taxes, or from, you know, wealth taxes, or from, you know, higher taxes on profits. And nothing stops government from raising minimum wage to $20. Nothing stops governments. So, you know, these are not economic issues in my book. These are political issues. These are governments that don't want to raise minimum wage. And even here in Ontario, the current Conservative government made a big fuss about raising the minimum wage to 15, and they didn't do it because they argued, oh, it's going to drive businesses out of business and stuff, completely, you know, forgetting the principle of aggregate demand that Robert talked about. So I think the biggest challenge is to accept the fact that these are political questions, not economic questions. And one of the reasons some governments are still thinking like that is that there's a big confusion between microfinance, you know, the finance of the household, and the macrofinance, the state. And so maybe households, certainly we face budget constraints for sure, but that's not the case about the government anymore. What we have is simply a refusal by governments to expand social safety nets. National daycare in Canada is coming, but it took decades to get there, to get here. And it took COVID to get there. And it's costing a lot of money. But, you know, the idea is that this is going to have crowding in effects, gender participation in labor markets, and et cetera. So there's going to be crowding in effects from such programs. So it's not a question of we can't afford it, it's we don't want to adopt it. Okay, so just to end, the way I see economics is really about first figuring out what kind of society we want. And I like my colleague Robert very much, less so the United States. But if you do want to live in a society where you have a lot of private healthcare and private education and et cetera, fine, you can do that. You can move to the United States and live in that kind of society. But if you want a society where, you know, income distribution is important, where discrimination is important, then, you know, we can fix these problems through political activism and, you know, adopting governments that we want. And then we figure out how to get that society that we want. And that might imply, you know, higher minimum wages and, you know, higher taxes on the rich and profits, on higher taxes on capital gains and a wealth tax. And it might involve a policy of full investment. So sure, I believe in full employment. I just don't think full employment is enough. It doesn't go far enough. Keynes in chapter 22 talks about full investment strategies. And if you stop to think about, I've got a paper coming out on that soon. If you think about what full investment means, you can see that it just brings up a whole range of possibilities. Again, I just wanted to say income distribution, just do it. I'm not trying to sell Nike shoes, but it is a good slogan and I completely accept it. Okay, that's my talk. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me, by the way.
Thank you very much, Professor Russon. Well, for me, I recognize indirectly the idea that we need to put attention on individuals' welfare or on social welfare, right? But maybe it's a big question, no? How to improve individual social welfare. But could you give us some ideas? Would you, in your experience, maybe in the political or empirical, what could do or what researchers in general to improve this, maybe with theory, or we could do some empirical research, I don't know, to improve this topic in particular, the individual's welfare or social welfare in general.
I'm not sure if I'm going to exactly answer your question, but for me, I'm a big income distribution guy. I think that the discussion begins with income distribution. I always tell my students that, income distribution is the foundation. And you can build whatever you want on top of that, but if the foundation is not very strong, it collapses. And I think that this is what happened in 2007 with the financial crisis. I mean, if you look at Piketty has a very interesting graph about income distribution between the 1% and the 99%. And he shows that in 1929, right before the big the Depression, income inequality was just as bad as it was in 2007. And it's anecdotal, but I think there is some empirical evidence. Of course, Robert showed that the old Keynesians put income distribution at the heart of their analysis. And I believe that post-Keynesians in general would agree with that statement. If income distribution is rotten, it's just a question of, well, then that brings in issues of secular stagnation from a aggregate demand perspective. And then eventually you're just going to end up with another crisis. And, oh, the recording stopped. And, yeah. And, in terms of income distribution. So that's what we have to address in terms of theory that you mentioned, do more research on the importance of income distribution. Because there's a lot of people out there and a lot of economists who are not convinced of that. And in terms of the implications, the consequences of income inequality. And it's not just a moral question, but it is an economic question. Greater income equality leads to I think, better welfare, personal welfare, social welfare, etc. That's my dog Maynard playing with his toy.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you all for your excellent dissertations. Now, I want to conclude. Well, we need to conclude, and you have 1 minute to say something to resume your ideas, or in general with the conference of the other speakers. We start with Professor Pierre-André Hudon, please.
I don't have much to say except for to thank you, to thank for having us. And I think that maybe if there was one theme that was common to all three panels, was the importance of the state and the importance of actually having a strong, capable state that works for the common good, because it's pretty much the only thing we have to ensure common good. Thank you.
Okay, now Professor Robert Flecker, please.
Well, also I took much time earlier, so I don't want to add too much, but I think I would agree with what Professor Hudon just said, that I think all of our presentations have highlighted the important role of the state and of public administration, and partly because the government really does have enormous capabilities, and that they're so important not only in a crisis like COVID, but also for long-term development. And I think this is a big issue in Latin America, because there's been a kind of almost ideological assault on the state and its capabilities throughout Latin America. The country I know best is the country of Lisette, Mexico. And, you know, there was a big debate in Mexico in the 1980s, and unfortunately the wrong side won, in my view. Mexico reached the limits of its growth strategy based on import substitution. It saw a need to move toward export promotion. That was correct, but it was kind of done the wrong way by just opening up the economy, deregulating, privatizing, and with no kind of industrial policy or state management of any kind. And it was very different from the model that had been followed in East Asian countries like South Korea, Taiwan, later China, which had a mix of a public and private role that turned out to be extremely effective for promoting development. And when I would talk to Mexican friends, well, it depends which Mexican friends, but the defenders of the neoliberal approach, I say, well, why don't you do what, you know, Korea and Taiwan did? And they would say, oh, well, we don't have the state capacity that they have. But well, why not develop it? You know, it's so crucial. And so that is something that we could talk about economic theories and models all we want, but you do need competent administration to make those policies get enacted. And by the way, it's not an accident that in the United States, yes, this country is a mixed blessing in many ways. You know, the right wing, Trump people are really putting an assault on the public sector and on public administration. Now, as Professor Houdon said, thankfully they did not succeed during the Trump years, but they derided the, you know, government workers as the deep state and tried their best to put political people and frankly incompetent and ideological people in charge of government agencies to kind of wear down their ability to serve the public interest. And so it's something we have to be watchful for. Otherwise, I would just also thank Professor Russon for his presentation. As I expected, we complemented each other. I knew he could say much more about monetary policy, especially than I could, and its close cousin, fiscal policy. And so I thank him for that. And I thank once again, Doctora Mendez and the organizers for this fabulous conference. And I hope that the next time I am in a conference in Ecuador, it will actually be in Ecuador. I have never been there. I would love to visit, and that we can get together in person la próxima vez. Gracias.
Of course. We hope to have you in present here in the University Ecotech in the future. Okay. Then the final resume or comments, please, Professor Philippe Russon.
Thank you. Again, thank you for having us. I very much enjoyed hearing all the presentations. I want to end simply by, you know, there's a lot of ways I can end this, but I'm just going to end on monetary policy because it's what I really am working on. You know, the current model of monetary policy, it rests on the idea that fine-tuning the changes of interest rates will have an impact on consumption and investment, which in turn impacts output, which is your IS curve, and then through the Phillips curve impacts inflation. And then, you know, you drift down towards your inflation target. I want to say that both of these relationships that are necessary for monetary policy from a mainstream perspective to work must be found empirically. But in reality, empirically, it's very difficult to find an IS relationship and equally or more difficult to find a Phillips curve relationship, so that the whole apparatus of monetary policy collapses. And the whole thinking about using monetary policy to achieve an inflation target is problematic and leads to increased many incremental increases in interest rates, which then finally collapses the economy, which is what Keynes precisely said. It cures a disease by killing the patient. So we really have to rethink monetary policy. How does it work? What's the transmission mechanism? And I would argue that it is through income distribution. So that's what my research for the next 5-6 years will be about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, the Faculty of Economics and Business of Ecotech University, thank you, all of you, for your brilliant participation. Your certificates will be sent to you as soon as possible, and we hope to see you very soon in Ecuador. We also would like to thank everyone to attend this panel, professors, students, and the public in general. We are sure it was an enriching presentation for all of us.
Thank you.
That's all. Thank you very much.
Gracias a ustedes. Buenas tardes.
Bye-bye.
Buenas tardes. Que tengan. Have a nice day.
Nos vemos.
Gracias.
Bye.
Au revoir.
Merci.
Bye.